In this video, we're going to get you started with the Turbo Tools add-on for Blender, which gives you real-time compositing and other things in version 1. More functions to come for different areas of Blender going forward. If you've not got it yet, you can go to www.3d-illusions.co.uk. I'll put the link in the description below as well. And once you're on there, just click on the Turbo Tools section, and this will pop up a little window where you can look at all the different features that it's got in it. In Blender, click on Edit, Preferences, Install, go to the latest version that you've downloaded. New versions will be released regularly with new features. So we'll install that one, we'll enable it, and then we've got a few options. So the most important option is the cache folder. So the cache folder basically is where you're going to store two different types of cache. You've got the render layer cache and you've got the standard cache. So render layer cache is going to store every single render for each scene and each camera in the project. So you need to set this for individual projects. You can have as many blend files referencing the same project folder as you need to make sure they can all access it. Alternatively, if you're starting a new project or you don't want to overwrite previous cache or renders, then what you can do is just change that to a different cache folder. Okay, so keep cache. Well, if you're rendering an animation, you're going to need to keep every single render for every frame. So make sure you check keep cache. If you're just doing still images, then it makes sense to turn that off, because then you won't be saving images unnecessarily for different frames. Okay, and the last bit we've got are the compositor performance options. The first one is wait for compositor to finish. Basically that means that before the timeline can move to the next frame, it will wait for the compositor to finish processing any nodes that are in there. If you want to get faster frames per second and you're not bothered about artifacts, then you can turn that off. But ideally I would leave it checked so that you get nice smooth playback. The next options are the render layer cache and standard cache bit depth. The render layers node is replaced after render by a render layer cache node. And the render layer cache node can either be 32-bit or 16-bit. If you leave it at 32-bit, then it will match the quality of the render layers node. However, for standard compositing, you can generally get away with 16-bit. So you may want to turn that down to save hard drive space. And the same goes for standard cache. This is cache nodes that you manually add to the node tree. And because these are discarded during publishing, this is by default on 16-bit to save space on the hard drive. And lastly, we've got the cache file resolution. So the resolution is based on the output resolution in the Blender output properties. So say for example this is 1920 by 1080. This will be 30% by default of that value. Or if you set it to 50% here, it will be 30% of half of this. For an i7-7700K with the GTX 1070, if I was rendering at 1080p, I found that 30% gave good quality, a good speed frames per second, around about 30 to 40 frames per second. If you've got a really slow machine, you might want to reduce this. If you've got a really fast machine, you may be able to get away with increasing it. And it will only affect the standard cache nodes. It won't affect the render layer cache nodes. They will always be at whatever you've got set in the render output properties. So now let's move on to actually using the product. So if we go over to the compositor, this is a fresh scene. User nodes is not checked and there's nothing in here. If we go back to layout, we can render this by pressing F12. We'll get a message saying we need to save it, so we'll save it before we continue. Okay, and now if we press F12, we get a little message saying the compositor user nodes has been turned on to enable the caching. So now if we go to compositing, you can see we've got the render layers node that I was talking about earlier, and now the render layer cache node. What we need to do now is add a cache to this, or a backdrop. So firstly we'll add a backdrop. Let's add a reroute. Okay. So we've got this image, and let's say we want to add some complicated nodes. a denoise node, and then maybe sunbeams. You can see already it's becoming quite slow to process. Let's go into the Turbo Tools section, and we can change the backdrop size in here. It's just put there for convenience. It's the same one you've got in here, just so you can see everything. Let's re-render this, so F12. Incidentally, we've got different render options now. If we go into the top, the default render for Blender has now been removed and replaced with these render options. And this is because to make sure the caching system works correctly, it needs to do additional things before and after rendering. So make sure you use these ones. Okay, so that took quite a while because obviously it had to, as well as rendering, it had to denoise and then use the sunbeams. So now, if I had an RGB curve, for example, and plug this in there and try and move something, so let's turn up the brightness, you'll notice at the bottom the compositor is working away, and it takes quite a long time until we get a result. And this is where caching comes in. So if we go into the caching section, we can click on the node that we want to cache, and then click cache. It will render one more time, and it will give us this new cache, which is currently a different side. And to fix this, click on either the viewer or the reroute or anything before the viewer, and then just click on Add Quality Node, and that will bring the size back up. Okay, but now the difference is if I duplicate this and bring it over here, you can see rather than having to wait several seconds for anything to happen, it's immediate. Okay, so that's how we do that. The other options we've got are to uncache. So if we remove this as you would normally, so let's click on the cache node. If I delete this, but the cache is still going to exist on the hard drive. So if we go into the folder, you can see it's created a cache and a render layers cache. So this is the render, and then inside the cache, this is the cache for the cache node that we've just deleted. So we don't necessarily want that to happen unless we plan to press undo, in which case the cache node will come back and it will continue using the existing cache. To remove it properly, we can either clear the cache if selected and then manually delete the node, or we can uncache. So if you click a cache node or an original node that is already cached, you click on cache or uncache, it will find out whether it's cached or not and then either add it or remove it, and it will also clear it from the cache folder as well. We've got a few options. We've got refresh all and refresh selected. So let me just show you why there are two different options. So let's bring this cache back on here. I'll recache this, the directional blur, and I'll add a new cache node after this. So that rendered really fast because the system's smart enough to know how far down the branch it needs to go in order to get the result, the correct result. It doesn't re-render all of these when you add a new cache node, basically. However, if you want to refresh, if you make a change here, it's not going to show up until you refresh. If I refresh all, then it's going to refresh this and all of its downstream branch nodes as well. But if I choose refresh selected only, so let's click on this cache node, and I choose to refresh just this one, you can see that's immediate. It didn't have to do these. But if I then, let's bring that back down, and I'll choose refresh all, it's going to take a long time because it's got to refresh every single cache node in the branch. So always use this one, refresh upstream and selected, if you've not changed anything before another cache node that's downstream. Alright, and just incidentally, if I change this one, and if I change, let's say, we'll give this a spin of 1, and choose to refresh just this one, so I choose refresh selected and upstream, it searches for any cache nodes that are dependent on this one that are upstream, and then it also refreshes those as well. So another use case for the cache nodes is to simplify the node tree. So you quite often are going to run into a scenario where you've got wires all over the place. This is a very simple example of that. In a real world case, you're probably going to have thousands, well, hundreds of wires, making it quite difficult to see what's happening in the node tree. So what you can use the cache nodes for is to, if you duplicate them, they maintain their relationship with the original node. So if I make any changes on the original node and then update, it will update all of these. So let's see how that's useful. So let's wire these up. So instead of having all that mess, we've now got a much more simple node tree to look at. And we can select these and maybe hide them. And then you've got rid of all that mess. And you can put these anywhere on the node tree now. They don't have to be next to each other. And they're always going to be in sync with whatever this one is here. So let's have a look at that. If I change a setting now on here, so let's say I change this to 360, and I change this as well, maybe make it a bit brighter. I can click on this cache node and choose to refresh selected and upstream. You can see it's done this for this one, but also it's done it for this one, this one, this one, and this one. So basically any cache node you've got that's a duplicate will inherit the same EXR and will always be updated as well. And there's two ways to get rid of these cache nodes. You can either click them individually and then choose cache uncache, and it will automatically wire up the original, or you can click on a multiple. So let's click on this one and this one, do the same, cache uncache, and it will get rid of both of them. Or you can click the original node and then choose to cache uncache, and it will automatically unwire both of those and then make the new connections as well. And the same goes for the render layer cache node as well. So the last thing to look at regarding these cache options here is how we use them during an animation. And it's much the same as we use it during a still image, with a few differences. So if we go into the layout section and play this back, we've got a very simple animation setup. If we go to the compositor and press play, you can see at the moment we've got one image, and that's the render layer image 1. And that's because we've only currently rendered one frame. It will always try and get the correct frame, but if it's not there, if it's a render layers cache node and not a standard cache node, it will just load the most recent one in. Okay, so what I need to do is add another cache node. So I'm going to add a cache node before I render, and the reason is if I do it this way, it's going to calculate the cache during the render instead of me having to do it afterwards. So Control F12, you can see it's created all these additional nodes, and this is to generate all the cache that we need. And when it's finished, we can press play, and we're immediately going to get playback at full speed. So the difference between using it for still frames and using it for animations is, if I change something downstream now, it's going to zoom in to let us know it's recalculating, and when it's finished, it will automatically go back to playing at the normal scale at full speed. And again, we can use all the same things as before. We can duplicate this and change. If I change that, it's going to do all three of these. And during playback, obviously we can also continue to work on the node tree. So let's just move this out of the way, and then let's add some nodes in there. And you'll notice that the compositor updates in real time now, rather than waiting until we release the mouse. And if it ever gets slow, so if I put something quite expensive in there, like a sunbeams, and turn those up a bit, you see that's becoming really slow. All I'll do with this selected, click on cache, uncache, it will add the cache node, it will zoom in, when it's finished, it will return to normal speed, and you can see we're getting good frames per second again at the top there. If it's a little bit slow even when it's cached, you can look at the performance options. The performance options work using the quality node. So we've got the, if you look before the viewer, if I take this out, we've got 22 frames per second, and the playback quality slider is going to have no effect whatsoever. It only affects the output of a quality node. So let's select the viewer node. Whatever we select, if we click on the add quality node, the quality node will be placed before it. And what I can do now, if I turn the quality down, we're going to get slightly better performance. So we go up to 31 frames per second. And the reason this is going so slow is because I'm using, well, there's a couple of reasons. If we look at the tree, we've added a cache file during playback. And the problem is, at the beginning of playback, when you first press play, it's going to mute anything downstream that it doesn't need. So it doesn't need to be loading these two images here. So if I just press play to stop playback and press play again, then we're going to get faster playback straight away. The second reason why it's going a little bit slower than normal is because you can see here I've got the cache resolution set quite high, almost double what I would normally have it set to. So if I go in here, turn the cache resolution down to something like 28, and then on this one, I'm going to just choose to refresh this one alone. And to do that, during playback, I'm going to click on clear cache if selected. And it's going to zoom in. It's recalculating this. And then it's going to come back playing much faster. So we're getting 38 frames per second or up to 60 frames per second now, while still maintaining decent visual fidelity by turning the playback quality down a little bit in the viewport. But this is where you're going to have to experiment with your system. One thing I must point out is that don't try and use a 4K image into a quality node. It will probably crash Blender. So always make sure you've got a cache node in between the input and the first playback quality or scale node. So that's going pretty fast. The playback quality node doesn't only have to be used for the viewer. So let's move this across. I'm going to turn the playback quality up a little bit. I'm going to put some expensive nodes in here now. So you can see that's going really slowly now. What we can do though, to speed this up, if I don't want to cache it, the alternative is to click the add quality node. And it's going to put that quality node before the glare node. Then if I turn the playback quality down, you can see we're getting faster because we're giving the glare node less data to try and deal with. And the beauty of this is that when we finally publish it out, the animation, using the publish tools, all of this quality node and cache is going to be ignored and it's going to render out at full quality. Unless we decide not to, which I'll come to. And lastly, wait for frame. Wait for frame, as I mentioned during the introduction, tells the playback to wait until the compositor has finished processing the nodes before it moves on to the next frame. Alright, so if I turn that off, if you watch the frames per second, we're currently getting about 38 to 39 frames per second. If I turn this off, it's going to shoot up. We're getting 60 frames a second, but nothing's really happening in the backdrop because it's only calculating what it can between the frames changing at whatever speed you've set in the output properties. And then you can turn the quality down until you start to get adequate feedback. To automate nodes during playback, what we can do is, with the graph editor visible, select a node that we want to automate. Well, in fact, firstly, we probably want to set a preview range. So just press P and then draw the range you want to concentrate on. And it's going to constrain the playhead to only go in that area. And now, for example, I've got this RGB curve. So I want to animate the factor. So I'll go to wherever I want it to start and I'll press I, and it's going to insert the keyframe wherever the playhead is. So I'll press I with the mouse hovered over the factor, and it's inserted the keyframe luckily at the first frame. If it had been somewhere else, what I could have done is just move it by pressing G and then X to constrain it to the X-axis so I can't accidentally move it up and down. And what I can do now is control right click another area to add additional keyframes, and I can move those around in real time until I've got it how I want it. And then once I've finished and I want to put the playhead back to the next, well, to the full area, I just press Alt P, and then we've got the full animation back. So moving on to the file output node section, what this does is it will automatically generate a file output node for every selected node in the scene. I've selected these two nodes. I'll choose a format that I want it to save to and click on Create and Wire. You can see it's created one file output node for each of those selected nodes, and it will automatically generate a path as well for each node based on the node name, or the node label rather. And it will also use the blend file as a path, just in case you decide to save several versions of blend file. That will save you from accidentally overwriting any file output nodes that you've rendered previously. The options that we've got are basically the format and only wired. So only wired, will click on there. It's only going to wire up from the original node any sockets that already have a wire coming out of them. Whereas if we turn on only wired off, it's going to create an output for each of these. So now what we can do, click on the file, we'll create a wire, we'll leave only wired off. We've got a JPEG selected. I'm going to choose to render frame 10 and then click on Resave Current Frame. It's going to create the folder and it's going to create an image for each of these input. Whereas if I delete those and I'll create a wire, only wired this time, resave again, and it's only going to create the one for the wired socket. If we do it for all frames, what we're going to do is go to any node on the tree. The resolution will be dependent on the resolution of the point on the tree it is. For example, this is 1920 by 1080. This is a little bit smaller. I think it was 1210 by 682. So any nodes upstream of this are going to get this resolution for the file output node. And this one rather, is 538 by 304. So this is where we lowered the cache resolution. Alright, so I'm going to do it on this one. I'm going to create a new file node, only wired, and choose to resave all frames. And there we are, almost immediately it's going to render it out. If we go to, it's going to be in a different folder this time because we're using lens distortion. We've got all the frames in there. And the beauty is that if you want to do several, so let me just undo this. Let's come in here. I'm going to delete both of these. And let's create 1, 2, 3 nodes, create a wire, and then resave all frames. It's going to output every single node we've got there, and we're going to get a folder for each, and inside each folder we're going to get a sequence of frames that we can then bring back into Blender for further compositing if we want to, or we can use it in a different software. Alright, so let's delete those, and let's move on to the last section, which is Publish. So the final section is the Publish section, and this is what's used to bypass the cache and output at full quality based on whatever we've got set up in the Blender output properties. So I've written the add-on in such a way that any errors or anything that you need to do will get a pop-up to let you know, so that you don't have to mess about looking in manuals, searching forums, or looking on YouTube. Alright, so if I try and render this, for example, publish current frame, we get a message, we can't publish a still image because I'm using a movie format currently. So let's go to the output properties. I'll change this to a still image format such as a JPEG and try again. We'll get another message. We need to set up a composite node because this area of Blender requires a composite node in order to output. So let's add a composite node. And we'll hook this up. And now, if we output and zoom in, we've got these two cache nodes. So if I publish this current frame now, and just pay attention to the wires here. So these are the cache nodes. We've got two cache nodes there. Publish current frame. It's going to unhook those cache nodes. so that we only get the full quality output. And if we go over now to the directory, it's just created this publish folder, and we've got the image in there, which should be 1920 by 1080p. The options we've got are quick publish. So quick publish will basically use the existing cache to speed up the publishing process so that you'll get a much faster draft if you need to show maybe a manager or a supervisor, director, a draft animation. You don't have to mess about waiting for the entire node tree to calculate every frame. It'll just use what you've already got. So let's quickly try that. We'll turn on quick publish, and this time when I choose to publish, you'll notice it doesn't unhook the wires. So let's just rename this and publish the frame. Get a new frame, LQ, and again, if I turn this off, publish frame, it does unhook it, and this will be a higher quality. So let's have a quick look. Click on this one. So that's the full quality, and this is the lower quality, virtually identical. So Blender's doing quite a good job of upscaling. So that's what the quick publish does. If you've got any missing cache, then those frames are going to be missing from the animation. So let's show you an animation. And by the way, if you want to add audio to your animation, then you can just use the video sequence editor to add an audio strip. Make sure you don't add a movie strip, otherwise that will override the whatever you've got in the compositor. So let's try that now with a MPEG, and we'll turn it back to quick publish so that it's fast. Publish animation. You can see it's working its way through using whatever we've got in that cache, and it's created that image, that movie, sorry. And it's still a reasonable quality. If we were to turn the quick publish off, it's going to take much longer because it's got to recalculate all of these downstream nodes. So let's just try that. Publish animation. You can see it's taking around about, in this case, around about a second a frame. I'm just going to speed this up. So now we've outputted it full quality, and it's practically, in this particular case, it's pretty much similar to the lower quality one we got from the much lower resolution cache. Speaking of which, there is one thing that might trip you up. So if we click on the node, you can see it's 577 by 325, but the output is 1920 by 1080. If you don't have a quality node between anything in the branch, which is a lower resolution than what you've got in the output, then you're going to output with a black border. So let me just show you that. I'll turn the quality node off by muting it, and you can see straight away it's shrunken the backdrop as well. And if I try now to output this, so quick publish, and then publish animation. This time, if we open this animation up, you can see it's still 1920 by 1080, but the actual bit we want is not being enlarged to fit the space. So make sure if you do have anything downstream which is of a lower resolution, that you add a quality node somewhere between the lower resolution item and the output. So let's turn that back on. So the next option is the include file output node. So this basically does exactly the same as what we've got up here. The only difference is it's going to output at full quality, because during a publish, if quick publish is disabled, then obviously even if we connect this to the cache node, so let's look at this, how to create a new file output node. Even though that is going into the cache, if I choose to publish now with the include file output turned on, let's have a quick look at this folder. We don't have that in there at the moment. So I'm going to publish the current frame. And then we go into the file output folder that's just been created. And you can see now we've got this image, which is 1920 by 1080. Whereas if we'd have done it before, up here, it would have been whatever resolution this is. So that would have been 577 by 325. Just to show that, let me go into the tool, into the turbo tool, and instead of clicking down in the publish area, I'll click on resave current frame. Let's select the file output node first. It's resaved it, and if we now refresh up here, hover over there, you can see the resolution is only 577 by 325. So that's the purpose for that. And say for example you've got several different variations and you want to render them all out at once, because you can only output one composite at a time. You can do that using the file output node, and then you can take the sequence of images and stitch them back together into a movie if you want to, or bring them back in to do further compositing. And that's it. So I hope you find the add-on useful. It's certainly going to be beneficial for my work. I do a lot of compositing because obviously if you get client work, the last thing you want to be doing is making amendments in the actual 3D viewport where you've got to re-render. And again, as I'm sure most of you are aware, you don't want to be trying to get a perfect image in the 3D view. It's always best to do it in the compositor, because you can spend hours and hours and hours trying to get your lighting right, your materials right, when it can take minutes in the compositor. Anyway, I hope it's useful. If you've got any suggestions or improvements or features that you would like, or any problems, let me know in the support email that you would have received when you purchased the product, and I'll do my best to get those implemented for you if I can. And I'll see you next time.